You want to know what it feels like to have 30 days to pack up 70 years of history because some lady in a yoga outfit decided your existence ruins her view of the sunset? I'm standing there on the porch of the Miller Creek Ranch, the same floorboards my granddaddy installed back in 1952, looking at this woman, Brenda Vance, who moved here 6 months ago and honestly believes she has the authority to evict me from my own dirt. She's clutching this leather-bound clipboard like it's a holy relic, her hair sprayed into a rigid blonde helmet that doesn't even flinch against the West Texas wind, and she's looking at my cattle like there's some kind of biological stain on her pristine vision of suburbia. The air out here usually smells like cedar, dry earth, and the honest scent of livestock, but right now it's being suffocated by whatever industrial-strength perfume she doused herself in, something that smells like a vanilla factory exploded in a chemical plant, and she tells me, with this terrifyingly sharp smile, that my, quote, livestock situation, end quote, is a violation of community standards. Now, you have to understand, my name is Silas Thorne, and until about a year ago, I was a suit and tie guy in the belly of the beast in Washington, D.C., working as a senior legal consultant for the Department of Housing and Urban Development. I spent 15 years writing the very federal regulations that govern how homeowner associations can and cannot operate across this entire country. So, I know the law better than most people know their own birthdays, but Brenda didn't know that. To her, I was just some rugged, stubborn rancher in dusty boots and a faded cap who didn't belong next to the new, end quote, Oak Haven Estates, end quote, development that had sprouted up like a subdivision-sized weed right against my fence line. She looked at me and saw a pushover, a local obstacle she could bully into selling my 40 acres so her developer buddies could pave it over for Phase 2, and she had no idea she was picking a fight with the one man who could dismantle her entire world with a few phone calls. This whole mess started when my father passed away and left me the Miller Creek Ranch, 40 acres of prime land with mineral rights that oil companies have been drooling over for decades. And I traded my cubicle for a wraparound porch because morning coffee just tastes better when the only traffic you hear is the lowing of Herefords and the song of a meadowlark. It's peace you can't buy, but apparently Brenda thought she could steal it. She moved from a penthouse in Austin to $1 million McMansion in Oak Haven, and within 3 months, she'd maneuvered herself into the HOA presidency, wielding that clipboard like a scepter of divine right. Her first move was a, end quote, friendly, end quote, visit to tell me the smell of my ranch was hurting the property values of the houses that were built 50 years after I got here. And when I told her, as politely as a Texan can, to mind her own business, she declared war. She started small, sending these ridiculous violation notices for, end quote, agricultural nuisances, end quote, and, end quote, aesthetic noncompliance, end quote, citing bylaws that didn't in oppos. To even apply to my property since I was in oppos. Part of her association, but she kept insisting that because my land bordered theirs, I was subject to their, end quote, environmental impact standards, end quote. Then she brought in her brother-in-law, a guy named Rick who worked for the county building office, and they'd sit in his truck on the public road with binoculars, taking photos of my old 1968 tractor and my manure piles like they were documenting a crime scene. It was a classic, end quote, squeeze play, end quote. Harass the owner until they're so exhausted by the bureaucracy that they just take the developer's check and run. But I wasn't in oppos, running anywhere. And that's when Brenda decided to hold an, end quote, emergency compliance hearing, end quote, at the neighborhood clubhouse, sending me a formal summons that looked like it came from a high court, but was actually printed on a high-end laser printer in her home office. I showed up to that meeting because I wanted to see how far the delusion went. And let me tell you, walking into that wood-paneled room felt like entering a kangaroo court in a bad movie. Brenda was sitting behind a long mahogany table with 6 other board members, all of them looking at me like I was a smudge on their glasses, and she had a PowerPoint presentation ready to go titled, end quote, The Miller Creek Biohazard, end quote. She started showing slides of my barn, calling it a structural eyesore, and even had a map that she'd clearly doctored to make it look like my fence line encroached 10 feet into HOA territory. But I just sat there, sipping their terrible, lukewarm coffee and waiting for my turn. When she finally stopped for breath and asked what I had to say for myself, I didn't in oppos. To get angry. I just leaned forward and asked for a certified copy of their articles of incorporation and the original land use covenants filed with the county clerk. The silence that followed was so thick you could have branded it. Brenda's smile didn't just fade. It curdled, and she started stammering about, in quote, proprietary internal documents, in quote, and how I didn't in oppos, to have the, in quote, legal standing, in quote, to request them, which is when I pulled out my old federal credentials and slid my business card across the table. I watched the blood drain out of her face as she read the words, in quote, Senior Policy Consultant, HUD, in quote, and I told her that under the Fair Housing Act and the Texas Property Code, refusing to provide those documents to an affected neighbor was a fast track to a federal audit. I saw a few of the other board members, mostly decent people like a retired librarian named Martha, start looking at Brenda with a lot of sudden suspicion because they'd been told I was just a, and quote, disruptive local, in quote, who didn't oppose, to understand the law, not the guy who literally helped refine the laws they were trying to weaponize against me. That meeting broke up in a hurry, with Brenda claiming she had to, in quote, consult with legal counsel, in quote. But that night, Martha, the librarian, followed me out to the parking lot, looking over her shoulder like she was in a spy novel. She whispered to me that Brenda had been making secret deals with a group called Vanguard Development, and that the HOA had been funneling money into a private, in quote, legal fund, in quote, that nobody could track. That's when I realized this wasn't an oppos, just a power-hungry neighbor. It was a coordinated land grab disguised as community management. I went home and spent the next 3 days digging, and what I found was uglier than a West Texas dust storm. Brenda hadn't an oppos. Just overstepped. She had never actually filed the final paperwork to make the Oak Haven HOA a legal entity in the state of Texas, meaning they had been collecting dues and fining people for nearly a year under an organization that technically didn't and oppos exist. It was a massive, multi-level fraud, and she was using the, in quote, nuisance, in quote, of my ranch as a smokescreen to keep the homeowners focused on an external enemy while she emptied their pockets. I decided to play it cool, letting her think she still had a chance. And that's when she made her biggest mistake. She decided to manufacture a crisis. One morning, I woke up and found Channel 8 News parked at my gate, with Brenda standing there in front of a group of kids wearing surgical masks, telling the reporter that my cattle were causing a, in quote, respiratory emergency, in quote, in the neighborhood. She'd actually paid a local lab tech to falsify air quality reports, claiming my ranch was emitting toxic levels of ammonia, and she was crying on camera about the, in quote, poor children, in quote, while I watched from my porch with a black coffee in my hand. But Brenda forgot one thing. Real journalist Don and oppos. Just take your word for it. And the reporter, a sharp guy named Elias, noticed that the, and quote, toxic, in quote, air seemed perfectly fine to the horses grazing 10 feet away. While Brenda was busy performing for the lens, I walked out and handed Elias a folder containing the real air quality tests I'd had done by the state the week before, along with a copy of Brenda's secret contract with the developer. The look on her face when the reporter turned the microphone back to her and asked why her name was on a finder's fee agreement for my property was the most satisfying thing I've ever seen. She tried to claim it was a, and quote, consulting agreement, and quote, but the damage was done. The community saw the strings pulling the puppet, and the rebellion inside Oak Haven started that afternoon. Martha and a few others organized a meeting without Brenda, and they found out she'd been using HOA funds to pay her own mortgage, disguised as, in quote, management fees, and quote, but Brenda wasn't oppos, going down without a fight. She was a cornered animal now, and cornered animals do stupid things. 2 nights later, my security cameras caught her and her brother-in-law Rick creeping onto my property at 2 a.m. with spray paint and several bags of what turned out to be industrial waste they'd hauled from a construction site, trying to dump it in my creek to create a real environmental violation they could report to the EPA. I didn't end oppos. Called the police right away. I called the FBI field office and a buddy of mine at the EPA's Criminal Investigation Division. I wanted her to finish the job so the charges would stick like wet cement. I watched the live feed as she spray painted, in quote, toxic, in quote, on my barn, her face clear as day in the infrared light, and then I walked out with a spotlight and a shotgun. Not to use it, just to let her know the party was over. The way she screamed and fell into the mud when that light hit her was almost poetic. I told her the feds were already on their way, and the arrogance finally broke. She started begging, offering me a cut of the developer's money if I'd just let her go, which I caught on a hidden mic clipped to my vest. The next morning, the Oak Haven Queen was led away in handcuffs in front of the whole neighborhood, charged with conspiracy, embezzlement, impersonating a government official, and felony environmental crimes. It turned out she'd done this before in 2 other states, moving in, seizing control of a new HOA, and flipping land for developers before anyone realized the association was a sham. She's currently sitting in a federal cell waiting for a trial that's likely going to put her away for 15 to 20 years, and the developer, Vanguard, is under a massive investigation that's halted their projects across the state. The Miller Creek Ranch is still here, and the new Oak Haven HOA, a real, legal one this time, is run by Martha, and we actually get along great. They buy my grass-fed beef, and I let their kids come over to see the calves in the spring. But it makes you wonder, doesn't it, Oppos? How many people are out there right now, living in a neighborhood they love, paying dues to a person who's secretly plotting to sell the dirt from under their feet? Most people think the law is this big, scary thing that only works for the rich, but sometimes, if you know where the levers are, you can use it to crush the bullies who think they're untouchable. I still sit on that porch every morning, and the air smells like cedar and sage again, with no hint of that cheap vanilla perfume. I've had people tell me I was too hard on her, that she was just an ambitious woman in a tough business. But I say when you try to burn down a man's family legacy to line your own pockets, you shootin' in Oppos. Be surprised when you get burned by the embers. So what do you think? Did I take it too far, or is this just what happens when Karen finally meets a guy who wrote the book she's trying to use against him? Have you ever had an HOA try to overstep their bounds, or did you find a way to fight back that made them regret ever knocking on your door? Drop a comment and let me know, because I have a feeling there are a lot more Brendas out there, and they're all clutching clipboards and waiting for someone to say, no,